My name is Joran Radom and I am happy to be part of the festival committee this year. And today I have taken a trip up to Hamar to the Norwegian Immigrant Museum. And I'm very excited to be able to meet the museum director, Terje Hasle Joranger.
And thank you, and you're heartily welcome to the Norwegian Immigrant Museum, and thank you. We're very proud to be a part of the program at the Leif Eriksen Festival this year.
And Terje, I understand that you also have connections to the US and to the Norwegian and Scandinavian population there.
Yes, throughout the years I've been working on doing research on Norwegian immigration to the United States, and I have made many acquaintances and friends throughout these years, and I think that we have some acquaintances in common. Among others, I've been a part of the program on the Tuesday open house in the Minnekirken in Minneapolis, and know several who are involved in those activities, and I have so many fond memories from my trips over there, and so I'm really happy to be a part of this festival, because I may know many of those who will be listening.
One main focus for the festival this year is the Sami culture and correlations to the Native American traditions in Minnesota and the US. And I understand that we will even get a taste of that in your exhibition here.
And yes, we also include the relationship between the white Norwegian settlers to the United States and the indigenous population, and the fact that the indigenous population had been driven away or were not present when Norwegians took the land, and that there are two different ways of perceiving ownership and the use of the land is also of great interest. And we also have some ties also to the Norwegian, what the authorities have done to the Sami population throughout the years. So we wish to create some ties in an understanding between how the indigenous population has been treated on several continents connected to Norway. But now I'm pleased to give you a tour of the museum. This museum has been here since the late 1990s, and it consists of 8 antique buildings which have been moved from the upper Midwest, from the states of Minnesota, Iowa, Wisconsin, North and South Dakota, and they form a permanent exhibit that is part of to show the immigrant experience. So the tour is based on these buildings, and we will tell the story about Norwegian immigration by doing this tour. We also have 3 separate exhibits that we'll include in the tour. But it all started in 1914, when there was a great exhibit in the Frogner Park to commemorate the signing of the Norwegian Constitution in 1914. When the idea was created to establish a museum that could take care of the heritage of those who had emigrated from Norway, because in 1914 immigration was still very large from Norway. So this was in the consciousness of Norwegians, immigration was. So, but then the war broke out, the World War I broke out during that exhibit. That summer, and also you had a Second World War and the 1930s, when it was difficult to work on these plans. But in the 1940s, some ties were created between the Nordmannsforbundet, the Northmen's Federation in Norway, and the Sons of Norway, the Bygdelagenes Fellesråd, and also the Consul General Norwegian Consul General in Minneapolis. They cooperated and they found a building in North Dakota that was used by the Sons of Norway that was dismantled and moved to Norway as the first building in the museum. It was moved to the Norwegian Folk Museum in Oslo, where it was supposed to be a part of a 13-farm plan that should show regional variations in buildings in Norway. So the immigrant cabins should constitute one of these 13. And this building behind us here became the Norwegian Immigrant Museum in 1955. Soon it was clear that there was not enough space at the museum because another building was moved as well from Minnesota. So it was decided that these buildings should be moved to a different location, to a new museum. Stavanger was one of the options, but Stavanger, because that was where the first direct immigration to the United States took place in 1925. But the climate in Stavanger is a coastal climate, and these buildings were built in a dry and drier climate in the upper Midwest. So Hedmarksmuseet, or Domkirkeodden in Hamar, received the buildings. Soon, in 1988, the Norwegian Immigrant Museum became an independent museum because we had been part of other museums before. And the buildings were then moved to a location near the Mjøsa Lake. Then in 1995, a big flood came, and the flood affected the buildings, so that we had to move the buildings to higher grounds. And this area where we are located now was an institutional area that was vacated at the time, and the buildings were moved here, where they are safe and where we also had the chance to grow and to establish and to move other buildings. So that's the reason why we are here. This is the Kindred House, built in 1873 near the town of Kindred in North Dakota. And this was used as a communal building for the settlers who lived here. It had various purposes. It was used as the first church, and as the first schoolhouse, as the first grocery store, and also as the first land office, because there was ample of land around here, so the deeds were signed here when you transferred land from the government to the local settlers. This is where the office was. Later, a new church was built in a separate location, a new school was built, but this was the very first building used for common purposes in the settlement. It later became a dwelling house where various families did live. And the first pastor in the area lived upstairs for a while. His name was Hellestvedt. And it was in use until the late 1920s, when it was sold to the Sons of Norway, who used it as a building for their organization before it was dismantled and moved to Norway. On the wall here, you'll see the route that the immigrants took in 1873 from Norway to North Dakota. They traveled by sail. So the steamers had started to be. There were steamers also in production, but there were still sailing ships. So this is from an ancient archive at the museum from 1871. And this shows the sailing vessels went through from Norway through the English Channel to Canada by way of Quebec and down the Great Lakes, and then they found various ports in Wisconsin or in Illinois where they landed and went inland from there. And here you see this is the site of this building in North Dakota. As you see, it's prairie and very different from where many of the newcomers came from. And Norwegians there are two important characteristics about Norwegian immigrants. The one is that a very high percentage of Norwegians chose to settle on land. They became landed and lived in rural areas. They liked the rural surroundings. Another important trait is that they settled very much in clusters, tightly together. So this is a township map, this administrative unit, showing many Norwegian names in close proximity to one another. And that was very common. In that way they could keep traditions, they could keep the language going, and they could keep the Lutheran faith in many instances. And you see they also chose to settle near a river because they could get water and also lumber for the building. And here is a deed signed by the US President Grover Cleveland. He was not actually signer, but this is the deed of this property at the time, and it's federal land. This was a part of the Homestead Act in 1862. Comprised this area, so larger lots of 160 acres were sold in this area. And we also may also think, if you look at this room, this was also the site, the site of the interior of sailing vessels, where the passengers were. So it's not very large. And you can imagine if the weather was bad, that they still all have to be in one room together, and there were children crying, and they were sick. But then finally, they could go, upstairs when the storm was over. It's also important that we can think about slave ships that were at one time with a similar area, but that the slaves were chained together and did not have the same chance to walk around like the immigrants did. That was what we call forced migration. So it's kind of mind-boggling to think about these various types of transportation across the Atlantic Ocean. It puts things into perspective. This building was built in Minnesota around 1883 on homestead land by Knut and Maria Gundersen. And Knut was from Krødsherad in former Buskerud county in Norway. And he and his wife raised several children in this one-room building. And this building was moved to the Immigrant Museum in 1963. It was donated by Knut's grandson, who then owned the farm. And the reason why this building was kept like it is that the Knut and Maria, they built another house because they had more children. And this was used as a summer kitchen because summers were so hot and in the Midwest. So for cooking purposes, it was easier to cook outside in this building. So it was located just beside the newer building for many years. So can you imagine how primitive really it was, and to raise 4 to 5 children in this building. But in many ways, by moving this building to Norway, it can also be preserved. We don't know the fate of these buildings if they had still been located in the US. So we're very thankful that we had a chance to do so. So this is a farmyard consisting of buildings from 3 different states. This the dwelling is from Minnesota, the barn is from Iowa, and then you have two buildings here. One is from Iowa and the other from Wisconsin. And these buildings were used for various purposes. Each building had a purpose.
In my mind, these buildings look like what we would call løe in Norway, where we would keep the hay through the summer. Is that what it was used for, or?
Yes, you would believe that it's a hay barn or a place where you store the hay, which was an important produce at the farm. But in fact, the building above here is a corn crib, and the corn was not common in Norway, so Norwegian settlers, they adapted the American name and Norwegianized it. So they called it kornkrybbe, which is it's interesting because they changed the language, and which also shows that they were in a process from being immigrants to becoming Norwegian Americans. It's the adaptation process to America. Then behind us we have another building. This is the granary where the grain was kept, and Norwegians usually refer to that building as a grøneri, which was similar, but which did not have any meaning in Norwegian. And Norwegian immigrants adapted to the American market economy. Many of them came from self-subsistence, where they lived off the produce from the farm. But in the US, the market was much more important. So cash crops, where you could sell your crops and receive cash directly was more common. So it was not uncommon that Norwegians kept the grain for several months to ensure that the prices rose, so they will get more cash for the crops. This is the Sack Whitney barn, built in Iowa around 1860 by an immigrant from Granvin in Hardanger. An addition was built later to the left, and the farm in the US is still in the same family. But we use it for exhibits. So the part to the right here is an exhibit about a Norwegian musher his name is Leonard Seppala from Troms. And you see the dog here, that's his lead dog Togo. Because Seppala he emigrated in 1900 from Norway because he wanted to become a gold digger in Alaska. Several of his friends had left before him, but then soon he started to realize that his interest was more in sports and in mushers as a hundekjøring with dog sleds. So he started to compete and became a very good sportsman and had many trophies. In 1925, diphtheria broke out in the town of Nome in Alaska, where he lived. And children got sick. This was in January, so they had to find a serum that could be transported. There were no roads, no airplanes, no trains. So mushers were called in to organize a race where they transported the serum from the closest railway station to Nome. And Seppala and Togo, the lead dog, they had the largest of these stages, more than 1,000 kilometers over an ocean that was with ice. So, but Togo was not the dog who transported the last stage. There was a dog called Balto that transported the serum, and Balto got became all the fame. Balto had a statue erected in New York, Central Park. He had books and movies, but Togo was forgotten. So this is a way to to show that Togo also deserves a place in the Norwegian American history. And in here you also, in the exhibit, you also will see that Roald Amundsen, the polar explorer, also knew Seppala. But Seppala and Roald Amundsen were only on the same, had the same status in the snow, because Roald Amundsen felt superior, because Seppala was, his father was of Finnish descent, was what we call the Kven in Norway, and the Kvens were not considered to be pure Norwegians. His mother was Norwegian, but the Kvens were marginalized. So in the United States, Leonard Seppala, he dressed in the Inuit costume, and he felt more at ease with the Inuits than the white Americans. So it's important. So we also see here that a group of people, the Kvens, were also looked down upon in Norway, and we see also the same with the Inuits in the United States. They were on the lower echelons of this racial society, racial hierarchy in the United States. To be white, to be Norwegian, and also to be Protestant was a way to get access to the American middle class. We also have some slides here from old photos that show the Norwegian immigrant experience. And the music that you can hear is an America letter from 1873 that was recorded by a group in our church at the museum. We have now left the first generation buildings that were built by the first generation of Norwegian immigrants, and now we're on the way to the buildings built by the second generation. But this statue is also a part of the museum exhibit. This is called the Handcart Pioneers, and it shows a marginalized group, a religious group, namely the Mormons, the Jesus Christ Church of the Latter-day Saints. About 5,000 Norwegian immigrants belong to that faith, and this also symbolizes the religious immigration, immigration for religious purposes. And we can go back to 1825 with the Restoration, when Quaker and Haugean sympathizers. Hauge was a lay minister, lay preacher in Norway, and a part in a way of the state church, but yet marginalized by the authoritarian state church. And the Handcart Pioneers, this is a statue. The original is standing in Salt Lake City in Utah. It's made by Torleif Knapphus from Vats in Rogaland, a Norwegian who adhered to that faith. And it tells about the hardships of the migrants who were persecuted when they were living in Missouri and in the Midwest. They were persecuted, their leader was assassinated, and they did not feel safe. So a way to escape and to form their own land, their own territory, was found in Utah. So this tells about the handcart. They walked from the Midwest to Utah with all their belongings. And it also may also symbolize the hardships when you come to a new country to start from the beginning. So we have an exhibit in the next building. This is a building that was one of the more recent ones, built in 1902 by a second generation immigrant family. But we have used the downstairs, the basement for exhibits. And our exhibit here is about Andrew Larsen Dahl, a Norwegian from Valdres, who became a photographer. And he has taken some amazing photos from 1869 to 1877 from Norwegian settlements in Wisconsin. That's really clear, and that shows how they lived at the time, costumes, building techniques, machinery, and who were present on the photos. So on one photo you also have the Norwegian flag with the Swedish colors in one of the corners in the 1870s. This building is what we call the Bjørgo house, built in 1902. And the first family that lived here was named Ingvaldsen. So the name of our cafe, which is in this building, is called the Ingvaldsens Cafe. Mr. Ingvaldsen was an immigrant from Hemsedal in Hallingdal, Norway. And he lived here for a number of years. In 1916, the Bjørgo family, originally from the Norwegian west coast, moved in here. And this family lived here until the late 1970s. We received the building some time ago, and we built it in 2017, and we used it as a cafe. And we also have used it for various other purposes, like thematic evenings with talks. It's kind of a cozy atmosphere in there, so it's part of our strategy of using the buildings actively. And it also shows the change from the first generation building to a second generation building. In first generation buildings you may see an ethnic architecture or ethnic building styles. But with this building you can see that this is a very common American frame house. And the transportation of materials on the train made these buildings look similar, because you had a mass transportation of materials. So they all buildings looked alike, and you could not discern any ethnic traits in them. But you see the size, the Gundersen cabin, you see the big size of this building as compared to that, the cabin. So this church was originally called the Oak Ridge Lutheran Church. It was located in Houston County, Minnesota, close to the town of Spring Grove, which is an ethnic Norwegian town in the very southeastern corner of the state. It was built in 1896, and it was organized by families that were living in the outskirts of the Norwegian settlement, because they had so far to travel to the main church. So they built this church, organized it, and different from Norway is that the congregations organized the building of the church themselves. They paid for the salary of the pastor. They had to send out a letter of call to a pastor. In Norway, the state church, in a state church, the pastors were paid by the state. So the congregations in the United States had more power in a way. And in fact, women were an important force in congregations, because they had bazaars and organized to get income to the church functions. And different from Norway, the churches in the United States were not only prayer houses, but also places where you could gather with social functions. So it was the hub of the community. So we had kvinneforening, ladies' aid, ungdomsforening, youth societies, choirs, and various activities that took place here. This is where many younger people fell in love and married also. Here is where you could exchange, you could sell land to another parishioner. So this was more than just the church. In the 1930s, that was when you had the maximum of members. That was the heyday of this church, and there was an addition built. This part of the church was built at the time. But then in the late 1960s, many people, following World War II, many people had moved to town, to the cities. So the population sank, decreased, and there were not enough sufficient members to support the church. So they had to close their doors in 1967. So the church was there, a foundation was organized to take care of repair work and the cemetery. But then the church was standing like this, empty for 25 years. But then the former director here came over and he met these representatives from the foundation, and they agreed to give the church to the museum. They gave an additional amount to support the rebuilding of the church. So the church was rebuilt here. It was reconsecrated. It was by the Vice Bishop of Hamar in 2002, and the Norwegian ambassador to the United States, Knut Vollebæk, held the inauguration speech. So, and also in 1914, many Norwegian Americans were here to give a big gift from the immigrant Norwegians to the Storting, to the Norwegian Parliament. And that amount grew as the years went by and was used for various purposes. And what was left of that amount, given in 1914 by Norwegian Americans, was given to the rebuilding of this church. So this is the Norwegian Memorial Immigrant Church. That's what it's called today. In the 1920s, more and more services started to be held in English. And an important reason is World War I. In 1917, the United States joined the war. They were neutral until then, but they fought the war against Germany, the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And in late 1918, the governor of Iowa issued a proclamation that said that English should be spoken in official places. Otherwise, you were not regarded as a loyal citizen. So therefore, many pastors started to hold services once in a while in English. And that process went on. But in 1946, when a new pastor came here, all services were held in English. And that was the faith in many Norwegian congregations in the United States.
So this church is very beautiful. Is it still in use in any way?
Yes, the church is in use, and it's used by the local congregation here in Ottestad, sometimes every year, for their own services. And we also have held 90 weddings and baptisms here since the inauguration in 2002. And we have a symphonic orchestra that has played here for at least 10 years. And the music that you listen to with the old photos and on the slides that you listen to, that CD is recorded in this building. So it has a good acoustic. And every December, the local pastor comes here and has the kindergartens around here. He assembled the kindergartens here to tell the gospel. So it's still in use. And as we don't have any large amphitheater on the museum, we use this as our gathering place for larger crowds. We're now in the Liet Christopher Schoolhouse, built near Letcher, South Dakota in 1882. A photo from 1902 shows that the school children here had Norwegian, Swedish and German last names. So this reflects the ethnic composition of the area. And this is a schoolhouse that's been well preserved. When the school was closed in 1968, a former pupil took care of the building and transported it to his farm and had it as his school museum for 35 years before he donated that to the Norwegian Immigrant Museum. So we're very thankful for all those individuals who have given buildings to our collections. And here you see a normal schoolhouse. In American schools, you had they taught English oral and written English, arithmetics, music, natural sciences, and also history, the state's history, and also national history and international. But here you can say that the time has stood still for many years. And the school closed in 1968 because of it was a school consolidation. So the pupils had to move to the closest town. But when I have visitors in this building, I usually ask them, is there something on the walls that reveal that this is not a Norwegian school building? So can you see anything here that reminds us of that is not Norwegian?
And I think also the capital letters in handwriting is different.
Yes.
From the style that we use here.
Right,
So
right. Yes, yes. And also the second illustration that you see down there to the Declaration of Independence, which is also a uniting document. And it says that all men are created equal. And I usually ask, were all people equal in the British colonies in 1776? For instance, some groups that we can say, are the groups that we can say that were not equal to other?
They were suppressed, and yes.
Right, yes, yes. Absolutely. And I can also add that the buildings here have all been located on lands that belong to the indigenous population. And the indigenous population, they were not present at the time that the Norwegian settlers came to the area in the land taking. They had been either moved forcibly to the west or had signed treaties with the US federal government and had moved. But I think that this is a missing part of the Norwegian immigration history, that we have to take into account that a whole population or populations of various nations were living on the same grounds that the Norwegians settled on. So the buildings that you see here, built by Norwegian Americans, those are the first buildings used by white persons ever on that land, which is also interesting. But we must keep in mind that these episodes of the history of suppression, and also that Norwegians prospered because of historic development, the forcible removal of an indigenous population.
So you're saying that the Norwegian settlers they settled on land that the indigenous people considered their land. Would you say that this has similarities to what happened in Norway with the Sami population?
Yes, there are similarities, and the perception of the status of the land is very different from indigenous culture and to Norwegian ethnic culture. Ethnic Norwegians consider land as a sign of wealth and status, that to own land gave status in society. But both Indian Americans and also the Sami population, the indigenous population, regarded land as a communal. That's something that was owned in common, and did not have that ownership in mind. They used the land and lived off the land. So you see some similarities here. When Native Americans were removed from their land in the United States, the US federal government sent in surveyors to survey the land and to make it available for purchase. And it gave, and then they sold out in pieces to newcomers. They preferred white settlers. So in fact, there was a racial hierarchy where the Anglo-Saxon elite was kind of decided who were where you were located on in that hierarchy. Norwegians were preferred. Native Americans were toward the bottom of that hierarchy. In Norway, you have the same thing. The Sami population in Norway was forcibly assimilated culturally into the nation building of Norway from the mid-19th century. And the same land there, they regarded the land as communal, owned in common. But there were Norwegians, ethnic Norwegians, were eager to regard it as the same land as land that could be owned and that could be settled on as farmers. So there were two different ways of perceiving land. Here we have the guide at the museum, Anna, and you will then say a few words about this new exhibit at the Norwegian Immigrant Museum.
I'm the guide during the summers. I will tell you a little bit about this exhibition inside. In this part, 50 individuals have been interviewed about items that their ancestors maybe owned, and it tells a lot about their story, about the heritage from being from a family of immigrants or Norwegian immigrants also. I believe there are 2 or 3 people who we've interviewed who tell. And this object right here is from the St. Olaf's College. The college was started by Norwegian immigrants in the late 1800s, and some have ancestors who have graduated here, and the college sweater is a bit untraditional maybe, but very traditional for Norway by the design. As you can see, it's a knitted sweater. This person shows an artifact about her native heritage, which is both native to America. Sometimes these type of artifacts are more than just an item. There's the spirit that is with them, that you can connect to your culture, and especially a person as this woman. She's a Native American and a Scandinavian, but she doesn't totally fit in either stereotype. She's often asked where she's from, and she says there's a sense of otherness because she doesn't have this stereotypical appearance.
Terje, thank you so much for this walk around your museum and for your very deep knowledge of what we are looking at and learning about. I hope that we can meet again. We might meet here, or we might even meet over in Minnesota, and maybe you will meet some of you who are viewing this program.
Thank you, Jorunn, and thank you for visiting the Norwegian Immigrant Museum. It's been a privilege, and I'm very honored to have shown you around at the museum. The museum has strong ties to the Norwegian American community and communities, and we very much want to keep that tie very strong. And thank you, and we hope that you enjoyed the museum, and that you wish to visit us. I will also add that in 2025 there will be a bicentennial commemoration of Norwegian immigration to America, and we have taken an initiative nationally in Norway, and we cooperate to organize activities, and we also cooperate with institutions in the United States. So I'm very glad that we could have this tour and to be a part of the festival. Thank you.